The day had started like any other for Special Agent Thomas Wilson. 20 years with the FBI had taught him to expect the unexpected, but nothing could have prepared him for what would happen at the end of his shift. It was just past 7 p.m. when Thomas pulled into the parking lot of Quick Stop, a small convenience store he often visited on his way home. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the asphalt as he stepped out of his unmarked car. He'd been working undercover for the past 6 months, tracking a group suspected of planning an attack on American soil. His appearance reflected his role: faded jeans, a worn leather jacket, and 3 days' worth of stubble. Nothing about him screamed federal agent, which was exactly the point. Thomas rubbed his tired eyes as he walked toward the store entrance. The bell chimed as he pushed open the door, and he nodded politely to the unfamiliar face behind the counter. A young man who looked barely old enough to drink, with a shiny new name tag that read Assistant Manager in bold letters. "Evening," Thomas said, making his way to the coffee station. The store was nearly empty, just an elderly couple debating which kind of milk to buy and a teenager browsing magazines. Thomas filled a large cup with black coffee, added 2 sugars, and secured the lid. The familiar routine was comforting after a day spent in the company of people he was working to put behind bars. As he walked through the snack aisle, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Thomas pulled it out, frowning at a text from his boss. Update needed ASAP. He slipped the phone back into his jacket and grabbed a protein bar, his free hand absently patting his other pocket where his FBI credentials and concealed weapon rested against his side. What Thomas didn't notice was the assistant manager watching him through the security mirror mounted in the corner. The young man's eyes narrowed as he saw Thomas put something into his jacket. The store had been hit by shoplifters 3 times that week, and the main manager had warned him to be extra vigilant or risk losing his newly earned position. Thomas approached the counter and placed his coffee and protein bar down. "Just these, thanks," he said, pulling out his wallet. The assistant manager rang up the items with shaking hands, his suspicion growing. The security camera above the snack aisle had been glitching all day, showing only static during the exact moment when Thomas had put his hand in his pocket. "That'll be $5.87, the assistant manager said, watching Thomas closely. Thomas handed over a $10 bill and waited for his change. He could feel the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. All he wanted now was to get home, write his report, and crash for a few hours. "Have a good night," Thomas said, grabbing his purchases and heading for the door. The assistant manager waited until Thomas had left the store before picking up the phone. His heart raced as he dialed the police. "Hello? Yes, I need to report a shoplifter. He just left the store. He's wearing a leather jacket and jeans. I saw him put something in his pocket, and the security camera went out at the same moment. I think he might have some kind of device to mess with our systems." Outside, Thomas was sipping his coffee as he walked to his car, his mind already composing the update his boss had requested. He didn't notice the police cruiser that pulled into the lot until its lights flashed once, briefly. 2 officers stepped out, one older with gray hair at his temples and deep creases around his eyes, the other younger with a stiff posture that suggested he was relatively new to the job. "Excuse me, sir," the older officer called out. "Could we have a word?" Thomas stopped, his training kicking in immediately. He set his coffee on the roof of his car and turned slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Evening, officers. Something I can help you with?" The older officer approached while his partner hung back slightly. "I'm Officer Reynolds, and this is Officer Patel. We received a call from the store about a possible theft. Would you mind if we asked you a few questions?" Thomas felt a flicker of surprise followed by annoyance. "A theft? There must be some mistake. I just bought coffee and a snack." He gestured to the items on his car. "The report says you may have concealed items in your jacket," Officer Patel said, his voice carrying across the parking lot loudly enough that the elderly couple from the store, now loading groceries into their car, turned to watch. Thomas sighed, realizing this misunderstanding could quickly become complicated. "Officers, I didn't take anything I didn't pay for. You're welcome to check my receipt." He reached slowly toward his back pocket for his wallet, but Officer Reynolds held up a hand. "Please keep your hands where we can see them, sir." Store security reported their camera system experienced interference at the same time. Thomas felt his jaw tighten. The situation was becoming increasingly frustrating, but he knew better than to lose his temper. Look, this is a misunderstanding. Sir, we're going to need you to turn out your pockets, Officer Patel interrupted, stepping forward. A small crowd was beginning to gather. The teenage magazine browser had come outside and was now recording with his phone, and a woman with a small child had stopped to watch from her car. Thomas took a deep breath. He could tell them he was FBI right now, but reaching for his credentials without warning could escalate the situation dangerously. Plus, he was working undercover. Having his face recorded while being identified as an agent could put months of work and potentially lives at risk. Officers, he said quietly, I understand you're doing your job, but I think we should move this conversation somewhere more private. I have identification that will clear this up. Sir, please turn out your pockets now, Officer Reynolds said firmly, his hand moving to rest on his belt near his taser. The assistant manager had come outside and was pointing at Thomas. That's him. Check his left jacket pocket. I saw him put something in there. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, calculating his options. The smart play was to comply, even though this was rapidly becoming a public spectacle. All right, he said. I'm going to empty my pockets, but I want to explain something first. Hands where we can see them, and empty your pockets slowly, Officer Patel said, his voice carrying an edge of nervous authority. Thomas nodded. My right jacket pocket has my phone. My left pants pocket has my wallet with the receipt. My right pants pocket has my keys. And my left jacket pocket has my phone charger. But officers, there's something else you should know before we continue. Empty your pockets first, sir, Officer Reynolds insisted. Thomas slowly pulled out each item as he'd described them. The teenage bystander had moved closer, his phone still recording. The assistant manager was watching with his arms crossed, looking vindicated. See? No stolen merchandise, Thomas said. Now, before we go any further, I need to tell you that I'm carrying a concealed weapon legally and I have federal identification in my inner jacket pocket. I'm going to need to reach for it very slowly. Both officers stiffened at the mention of a weapon. Officer Reynolds' hand moved to his holster, and Officer Patel took a step back. Sir, do not reach for any weapon, Reynolds said sharply. Place your hands on the roof of your car. Thomas complied immediately, spreading his fingers wide on the car roof. Officers, I'm a federal agent. I'm asking you to let me show you my credentials before this goes any further. Officer Patel exchanged a glance with Reynolds. We're going to need to pat you down for weapons first, Reynolds said, the first hint of uncertainty entering his voice. As the older officer approached to begin the search, Thomas could feel the eyes of every bystander burning into his back. 6 months of undercover work, potentially blown because of a misunderstanding at a convenience store. The thought was almost enough to make him laugh. Officer Reynolds approached Thomas with caution, his experienced eyes scanning for any signs of trouble. The parking lot had grown unnervingly quiet. Even the teenage boy who had been recording had lowered his phone slightly, sensing the tension in the air. I'm going to conduct a pat-down search, Officer Reynolds said, his voice measured and professional. Please keep your hands on the vehicle, Thomas nodded, keeping his palms pressed against the roof of his car. Just so you know, my service weapon is holstered on my right side, inside my jacket. My FBI credentials are in my inner left breast pocket. Officer Patel snorted. Yeah, right, and I'm the director of the CIA. The assistant manager from the store had edged closer, eager to see the shoplifter get his comeuppance. A small group of onlookers had formed a loose semicircle around the scene, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. Thomas kept his eyes forward, his jaw tight. 20 years in the bureau had taught him patience, but this situation was testing his limits. He knew the smart play was to let this unfold by the book, but every minute he spent here was a minute wasted on his investigation. Officer Reynolds began the search, his hands moving methodically down Thomas's sides. When his fingers brushed against the hard outline of the holstered gun, he froze. There is a weapon here, Reynolds confirmed to his partner, his voice dropping an octave. Sir, do not move. Like I said, Thomas replied calmly, it's my service weapon, FBI Special Agent Thomas Wilson. Reynolds continued the pat-down with heightened caution, finding nothing else besides the wallet Thomas had already removed. When he reached the inner jacket pocket, he carefully extracted a leather ID wallet. The moment Reynolds flipped it open, his face changed. The color drained from his cheeks as he stared at the golden FBI shield and the official credentials identifying Thomas as a special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Oh, hell, Reynolds muttered, his eyes widening. Officer Patel stepped forward. What? What is it? Reynolds handed the credentials to his partner, whose expression quickly mirrored his own. Patel looked like he might be sick. It's real, Patel stammered, looking from the credentials to Thomas and back again. Thomas lowered his hands from the car roof, turning slowly to face the officers. Now that we've established who I am, can we please move this conversation somewhere more private? He gestured to the growing crowd of spectators. The teenage boy had raised his phone again, capturing the officers' shocked expressions. The assistant manager had taken several steps back, his earlier confidence evaporating. Officer Reynolds handed the credentials back to Thomas with a hand that wasn't quite steady. Sir, we had no idea. We were responding to a call about shoplifting and potential electronic theft. Thomas tucked his credentials away. I understand you were doing your job, but this public spectacle could have serious consequences. As if to underscore his point, Thomas's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and his expression darkened. I need to take this, it's my supervisor. The officers exchanged nervous glances as Thomas stepped a few paces away to answer the call. Wilson, Thomas said, keeping his voice low. He listened for a moment, his shoulders tensing. Yes, sir. I understand. No, my cover hasn't been blown yet, but I'm currently dealing with local law enforcement who responded to a shoplifting call. False accusation. Another pause. The garrison group is moving tonight? Understood. I'll be there in 20. Thomas ended the call and turned back to the officers, his expression grave. Gentlemen, we have a problem. The group I've been tracking for 6 months is making a move tonight. I need to go, now. Officer Reynolds nodded quickly. Of course, Agent Wilson. We're very sorry about the misunderstanding. Sorry isn't going to cut it, Thomas said, his voice quiet but intense. That kid over there has been filming this whole encounter. If that video gets out, 6 months of undercover work goes down the drain, and we lose our best shot at stopping these people. Patel turned to look at the teenager who was now showing his phone to a friend who had joined him. I'll handle it, he said, moving toward the young man. Thomas grabbed his arm. Not like that. You'll just make it worse. Let me think. The situation was spiraling beyond a simple misunderstanding. If Thomas's cover was blown, the terrorist cell he'd infiltrated would disappear, potentially to resurface with an attack that could cost innocent lives. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force. Officer Reynolds seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. Agent Wilson, what can we do to help? Before Thomas could answer, the radio on Reynolds' shoulder crackled to life. All units in the vicinity of Harbor and Maple, be advised, we have reports of suspicious activity at the abandoned Carson warehouse. Multiple subjects, possibly armed. Thomas's head snapped up. The Carson warehouse was the location his team had been monitoring for weeks, suspected as a meeting point for the terror cell. That's them, he said, already moving toward his car. They're moving earlier than expected. Reynolds caught his arm. Wait, you can't just rush in there alone if they're armed. I don't have time to wait for backup. Thomas cut him off. Every minute counts. The older officer made a quick decision. Then we'll go with you. At least until your team arrives. Thomas hesitated, weighing his options. Having local police show up could spook the suspects, but going in alone was risky, and these officers owed him. Fine, he finally said. But you follow my lead. These people won't hesitate to kill a cop, and they're well armed. As the 3 men prepared to leave, the assistant manager approached, wringing his hands. Sir, I'm sorry about calling the police. I thought... Later, Thomas said dismissively, checking his weapon. He turned to Patel. Officer, I need you to handle the crowd. Make sure that kid deletes that video. Tell him it's a matter of national security. Patel nodded, his earlier cockiness replaced by a newfound respect. I'll take care of it, Agent. Reynolds was already on his radio, calling for quiet backup at the warehouse location. No sirens, no lights. Possible federal operation in progress. Thomas slid behind the wheel of his car, his mind racing. The confrontation in the parking lot now seemed trivial compared to what lay ahead. The terrorist cell had been planning something big, something that would make headlines across the country. And now, thanks to a case of mistaken shoplifting, their timetable might have accelerated. As Officer Reynolds climbed into the passenger seat, Thomas started the engine. Just so we're clear, what happens next isn't by the book. If you want out, say so now. The older officer buckled his seatbelt. I've never been much for books anyway. Thomas allowed himself a grim smile as he pulled out of the parking lot. In his rearview mirror, he could see Officer Patel talking to the teenager with the phone, gesturing emphatically. The kid's face had gone serious as he nodded, tapping at his screen. At least something was going right. As they drove toward the warehouse district, Reynolds broke the tense silence. So terrorists, huh? In our town? They're everywhere, Thomas replied, taking a sharp turn. They look like ordinary people, shop at the same stores, drink the same coffee. That's what makes them dangerous. Is that why you were undercover? At a convenience store? Thomas shook his head. I was following someone. The store was just a convenient stop, bad timing all around. The radio crackled again, and a dispatcher's voice came through. Unit 217, be advised. FBI has confirmed operation in progress at Carson Warehouse. All units are to maintain perimeter only. Repeat, maintain perimeter only. Reynolds looked at Thomas. Sounds like your people are already there. Let's hope so, Thomas said, pressing harder on the accelerator. As they approached the warehouse district, Thomas killed his headlights and slowed down. The streets here were deserted, lined with shuttered businesses and chain-link fences tagged with graffiti. The Carson warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking shadow against the night sky. Thomas pulled over 2 blocks away, cutting the engine. This is as far as we go by car. From here, we move quietly. Reynolds nodded, checking his service weapon. Just like old times. I was tactical response before patrol. Good to know, Thomas said. He reached into his glove compartment and pulled out a small earpiece, fitting it into his ear. Wilson checking in, he said softly. I'm approaching from the south with local PD. What's the situation? Reynolds watched as Thomas listened to a response only he could hear. Understood. Moving into position, Thomas finally said. He turned to Reynolds. My team is already in place. The suspects are inside, at least 6 of them. They're loading something into a van. What's the play? Reynolds asked. Thomas's face was grim in the dim light. We wait for my signal, then move in from multiple entry points. These aren't shoplifters, Reynolds. These people will shoot to kill. The enormity of the situation seemed to hit the officer all at once. What had started as a routine shoplifting call had led him to the brink of a counter-terrorism operation. All because we thought you stole something from a convenience store, he said, shaking his head. Sometimes fate has a twisted sense of humor, Thomas replied, checking his weapon one last time. Ready? Reynolds nodded, his expression resolute. As they slipped out of the car and into the shadows, Thomas couldn't help but think that this night was far from over. The confrontation in the parking lot had been just the beginning. The night air was cool against Thomas's face as he and Officer Reynolds crept between the shadows of abandoned loading docks. The Carson warehouse stood before them, a massive concrete structure with broken windows that glinted like teeth in the moonlight. Distant sirens wailed, but here, everything was eerily quiet. My team is in position around the perimeter, Thomas whispered, touching the earpiece. We've got agents on all sides, plus tactical support standing by. Reynolds nodded, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. The gravity of the situation had transformed the veteran cop. Gone was the man who had been ready to arrest a supposed shoplifter. In his place stood a professional with tight focus in his eyes. What exactly are we dealing with here? Reynolds asked, his voice barely audible. Thomas hesitated, then decided the officer deserved to know the stakes. The group calls themselves the Liberation Front. They've been planning something big for months. My team infiltrated their outer circle, but we've never gotten close to the leadership. Until tonight. They paused behind a dumpster about 50 yards from the warehouse's side entrance. Through the dirty windows, shadows moved inside. People carrying crates working with urgent purpose. "We believe they're planning to target the water supply," Thomas continued. "Something chemical, possibly biological. The details weren't clear, but the potential casualties..." He shook his head. "Thousands, maybe more." Reynolds took a sharp breath. "Jesus, yeah." Thomas checked his watch. "The FBI tactical team is 4 minutes out. But if these guys finish loading that van before they arrive..." "They're gone," Reynolds finished. "And who knows where they'll strike." Thomas nodded grimly. His earpiece crackled, and he pressed a finger to it, listening intently. His expression darkened. "What is it?" Reynolds asked. "They're ahead of schedule. Van's almost loaded. We're moving in now." Thomas pulled out his service weapon. "Stay behind me, follow my lead, and for God's sake, don't get shot." Reynolds drew his own gun, a familiar weight in his hand. "Been doing this job 23 years. Never thought I'd end up in the middle of a terrorist takedown because of a shoplifting call." Despite the tension, Thomas's mouth twitched in a half-smile. Life's full of surprises. The two men moved swiftly toward the warehouse, keeping low. As they approached the side door, Thomas held up a fist, signaling a halt. Through his earpiece, he could hear his team's final preparations. Every agent was in position. It was time. Thomas looked at Reynolds. "When we go in, stay to the right wall. My people will be coming in from all sides. Identify yourself clearly as police." Reynolds nodded, his face a mask of concentration. 3. Thomas counted down. 2, 1, go. He pushed through the door, weapon raised, Reynolds right behind him. "FBI, everyone on the ground now," Thomas shouted, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. Similar shouts erupted from other entrances as FBI agents poured into the warehouse. The scene inside was chaos. A large van with its back doors open, stacks of crates, and 6 people who scattered at the sight of armed agents. "Don't move," Thomas commanded, focusing on a tall man in a black jacket who appeared to be giving orders. "Hands where I can see them." The man in the black jacket turned, his eyes finding Thomas. A flicker of recognition passed over his face, followed by fury. He reached for something at his waistband. "Gun!" Someone shouted, and the warehouse erupted in gunfire. Thomas dove behind a stack of crates, pulling Reynolds down with him, as bullets splintered the wood above their heads. The din was deafening. Shouts, gunfire, the crash of overturned equipment. "Thomas Wilson," the man in the black jacket called out, his voice carrying over the chaos. "The delivery guy from the coffee shop." "I knew there was something off about you," Thomas grimaced. His cover was definitely blown now. He risked a glance around the edge of the crates and spotted the man taking shelter behind the van. His weapon trained on Thomas's position. "It's over." "Daniel," Thomas called back, using the terrorist leader's name. "The building is surrounded. There's no way out." Reynolds was breathing hard beside him, but the officer's hands were steady on his weapon. "Friend of yours?" he muttered. "We've met," Thomas replied dryly. "Coffee shop on 5th. He likes his lattes with extra foam." A fresh volley of gunfire cut their conversation short. Thomas could hear his team moving into position, gradually tightening the net around the terrorists. But Daniel and his people were putting up a fierce fight, and that van, loaded with whatever terrible cargo they'd prepared, remained a wild card. Thomas touched his earpiece. "Status on the van?" he asked. The response made his blood run cold. One of the terrorists had managed to get into the driver's seat during the chaos. The engine had started. "If that van leaves this warehouse, a lot of people are going to die," Thomas said to Reynolds. "We need to stop it." Reynolds checked his ammunition. "Tell me what you need." Thomas pointed to a stack of metal barrels about 15 feet away. "Cover fire. I'm going to make a run for those barrels, then try to get to the van. Can you keep their heads down?" The officer nodded grimly. "On your mark," Thomas tensed, preparing to move. "Now!" Reynolds leaned out and fired 3 rapid shots toward the terrorists' positions, forcing them to duck. Thomas sprinted for the barrels, bullets kicking up concrete dust at his heels. He slid into cover just as a shot pinged off a barrel inches from his head. From his new position, Thomas had a clearer view of the van. The driver was hunched over the wheel, preparing to ram through the closed warehouse doors. Daniel was providing covering fire from behind a forklift, his face twisted with rage. Thomas's earpiece crackled with urgent voices. The tactical team had arrived and was moving into position outside. But they'd be too late if the van broke through. A crazy idea formed in Thomas's mind. He looked across the warehouse floor to where Reynolds was still pinned down behind the crates. "Reynolds," he called out. "Remember that convenience store?" "Time to make up for the misunderstanding." The officer caught his eye and somehow understood. He nodded once, then began laying down suppressive fire, drawing attention away from Thomas. Thomas holstered his weapon and crouched, muscles tensing. Then, as Reynolds's barrage forced the terrorist to seek cover, he sprinted straight for the van. Daniel spotted him and swung his weapon around, but an FBI agent on the warehouse's upper level forced him back with a well-placed shot. Thomas reached the van, yanked open the driver's door, and found himself face to face with a wide-eyed terrorist whose finger was already tightening on the trigger of a pistol. Time seemed to slow down. Thomas struck first, knocking the gun aside as it fired, the bullet shattering the windshield. He grappled with the driver, their bodies twisting in the cramped space, fighting for control of the weapon. The van lurched forward, engine revving, heading for the warehouse doors. With a supreme effort, Thomas slammed the driver's head against the steering wheel, stunning him. He reached past the dazed man and wrenched the keys from the ignition. The van rolled to a stop just feet from the doors. "It's over," Thomas panted, dragging the driver from the seat and throwing him to the ground. All around the warehouse, the tide had turned. FBI agents had most of the terrorists pinned down or in custody. Daniel was the last one fighting, still firing from behind the forklift, but his position was hopeless. "Daniel Hoffman," Thomas called out, using the terrorist leader's full name. "You're surrounded. Drop your weapon and come out with your hands up." For a moment there was silence. Then Daniel emerged, his hands raised, his face a mask of defiance. "This isn't the end," he spat. "There are more of us. Always more." "Save it for your interrogation," Thomas said as two agents moved in to secure the terrorist leader. Reynolds approached, holstering his weapon. His uniform was dusty, and there was a small cut on his cheek, but he looked remarkably calm for someone who had just participated in taking down a terrorist cell. "Not bad for a shoplifter," the officer said with a wry smile. Thomas actually laughed, the tension of the last hour finally breaking. Not bad for a local cop either. Around them, the FBI tactical team was securing the scene, arresting the terrorists and beginning to examine the van's cargo. An agent in a hazmat suit approached Thomas. "Initial readings suggest a chemical agent, possibly sarin," the agent reported. "We'll need to bring in the full containment team." Thomas nodded, the reality of what they'd prevented sinking in. If that van had reached its target, a water treatment plant, a reservoir, a crowded venue, the death toll would have been catastrophic. Reynolds was watching the hazmat team with wide eyes. "All this, and it started because my rookie partner and I thought you stole a candy bar." Thomas placed a hand on the officer's shoulder. "Sometimes the smallest things lead to the biggest moments. You made a mistake, then you helped fix it. That counts for something." As the FBI secured the warehouse and local police established a perimeter outside, Thomas couldn't help thinking about the strange sequence of events that had led to this moment. A faulty security camera, an overzealous store manager, a rookie cop's suspicion, all tiny threads that, when pulled, had unraveled a deadly plot. The night wasn't over yet. There would be debriefings, reports, media to manage, but standing there in that warehouse watching Daniel Hoffman being led away in handcuffs, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Satisfaction. Thomas pulled his phone from his pocket and answered it. Turning away from the chaos of the warehouse where FBI agents were securing prisoners and evidence. "Wilson," he said, his voice rough from shouting during the raid. "Tell me you got them," his supervisor, Assistant Director Clark, said without preamble. "We got them," Thomas confirmed, watching as Daniel Hoffman was led away in handcuffs, surrounded by agents in tactical gear. "Hoffman and 5 others. We also secured their cargo. Preliminary testing suggests sarin or something similar." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "Good work, Wilson. Really good work." The relief in Clark's voice was palpable. "What about casualties?" 2 of Hoffman's men took minor injuries during the firefight. "No injuries on our side." Thomas glanced at Officer Reynolds, who was giving a statement to an FBI agent nearby. "Local PD helped with the takedown. 1 officer in particular." "The same local PD that detained you for shoplifting?" There was a hint of amusement in Clark's voice now. "The very same," Thomas said, allowing himself a small smile. It's been an interesting night. I want you back at headquarters for debrief as soon as the scene is secure, Clark said. And Wilson? The director is very pleased. This was a big win. The call ended and Thomas slipped his phone back into his pocket. A big win. 6 months of undercover work, countless hours of surveillance, all the close calls and false leads, all of it culminating in tonight's raid. They'd stopped a major attack before it could happen, saving countless lives in the process, and it had almost fallen apart because of a misunderstanding at a convenience store. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas as he made his way through the warehouse, now brightly lit by portable floodlights brought in by the FBI team. Hazmat specialists in bulky protective suits were carefully examining the contents of the van, cataloging the chemical agents and the dispersal devices the terrorists had planned to use. Officer Reynolds broke away from the agent interviewing him and approached Thomas. "Your people are very thorough," he said, nodding toward the team processing the scene. "It's what we do," Thomas replied. "How are you holding up?" Reynolds shrugged. "Been better, been worse. Not every day you help take down a terrorist cell." He paused, rubbing the back of his neck. "My captain's outside. He's pretty shocked about the whole thing." "I imagine so," Thomas said. "Don't worry. I'll make sure everyone knows how instrumental you were in stopping these guys." A commotion at the warehouse entrance drew their attention. A group of people in suits had arrived, led by a tall woman with short gray hair and an air of authority that parted the crowd of agents and officers like water. "That's the director," Thomas said quietly. "She doesn't usually show up at crime scenes." Reynolds straightened his uniform, suddenly self-conscious. "Should I make myself scarce?" "Quite the opposite," Thomas said. "She'll want to meet the cop who helped bring down Daniel Hoffman." The FBI director, Catherine Powell, made her way directly to Thomas, her sharp eyes taking in the scene around them. "Agent Wilson," she said, extending her hand. "Excellent work." "Thank you, Director," Thomas replied, shaking her hand firmly. "Allow me to introduce Officer Reynolds of the local police department. He was crucial to tonight's operation." Powell turned her attention to Reynolds, who stood a little straighter under her scrutiny. "Officer," she said, shaking his hand as well. "I understand you were involved from the beginning." Reynolds cleared his throat. "Well, ma'am, that depends on how you define the beginning. If you mean the convenience store where we mistakenly detained Agent Wilson for shoplifting, then yes." To his surprise, the director smiled. "I've been briefed on the unusual circumstances that led to tonight's raid. Sometimes fate works in mysterious ways." "That's one way of putting it," Thomas said. The director's expression became serious again. "The chemicals we found in that van would have caused devastation on a scale this country hasn't seen since 9/11. Everyone involved in stopping this plot has my personal gratitude." She turned back to Reynolds. "Including the local police department?" Reynolds nodded, clearly moved by her words. "Just doing our job, ma'am." "As we all are," she replied. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to speak with the hazmat team." With that, she moved off toward the van where the specialists were still working. Thomas and Reynolds stood in silence for a moment, watching her go. "She seems nice," Reynolds finally said. Thomas laughed, the sound unexpected even to himself. "She's one of the most feared people in Washington, but yes, she can be nice when she wants to." Outside the warehouse, dawn was breaking, pale light seeping through the broken windows. News vans had begun to arrive, kept at bay by a police barricade a block away. Reporters stood with microphones delivering updates to early morning news shows, though they had few details about what had actually happened inside. Thomas's phone buzzed again, a text this time, from his team leader. "Press conference in 30, director wants you there." He sighed, pocketing the phone. The aftermath of an operation like this was always draining. The reports, the debriefings, the press. All he wanted right now was a hot shower and about 12 hours of sleep. Reynolds seemed to read his thoughts. "Long day ahead?" "The longest," Thomas confirmed. "You should get some rest. Your part in this is done." The officer shook his head. "Not quite. I still have to explain to my captain why I decided to join an FBI raid without proper authorization. And then there's the paperwork." "Ah, the paperwork," Thomas said with feeling. "The one thing the FBI and local police have in common: mountains of forms to fill out." A young FBI agent approached them, looking slightly nervous. "Agent Wilson, there's a situation outside you should know about." Thomas and Reynolds followed the agent to the warehouse entrance. Through the open doors, they could see the police barricade where a familiar figure was arguing with the officers holding back the crowd. The assistant manager from the convenience store, still wearing his name tag. "You don't understand," the young man was saying, his voice carrying across the distance. "I'm the one who called the police. I'm the reason they caught the terrorists." Thomas groaned. "You've got to be kidding me." Reynolds chuckled. "Fame seekers. They show up at every major incident." "This one actually has a point, though," Thomas said reluctantly. "If he hadn't called you guys about the supposed shoplifting, we might not have tracked Hoffman's group to the warehouse tonight." The assistant manager was growing more animated, gesturing wildly as he tried to convince the officers to let him through. A news crew had noticed the commotion and was filming the exchange. "Should we do something about that?" Reynolds asked. Thomas considered it for a moment, then shook his head. "Let the local officers handle it. The less attention drawn to the whole shoplifting misunderstanding, the better. The focus should be on the terrorists we stopped, not how we happened to find them." They turned back into the warehouse where the activity was starting to wind down. The terrorists had been taken away for processing. The hazmat team had secured the chemical agents, and the evidence response team was finishing their work. "I need to head to headquarters for the press conference," Thomas said. "But I wanted to say..." "Well, thanks. Despite how things started, you really came through when it mattered." Reynolds nodded, a hint of embarrassment crossing his face. "Just doing my job. Though I have to admit, this was a bit outside the usual scope of a patrol officer. You'd make a good federal agent." "You know," Thomas said, surprising himself with the observation. The officer laughed. "Thanks, but I'm happy where I am. 23 years on the force, 3 years from retirement. I'll leave the terrorists and spy stuff to you young guys." "Fair enough," Thomas said with a smile. He extended his hand. "It was good working with you, Reynolds." The officer shook his hand firmly. "Likewise, Agent Wilson. Maybe next time we meet it won't involve me accusing you of shoplifting." One can hope. As Thomas walked away, heading for the black SUV that would take him to FBI headquarters, he couldn't help reflecting on the strange turns life could take. 6 months ago, when he'd been assigned to infiltrate Hoffman's network, he never could have predicted that the operation's success would hinge on a false shoplifting accusation and a local cop with a steady hand and cool head. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the industrial district. News helicopters circled overhead, and more press had gathered behind the barricades. Soon the director would stand before them and announce a major victory in the fight against domestic terrorism. The names of the Liberation Front members would be released, their plot revealed. The country reassured that a terrible attack had been prevented, but some parts of the story would remain untold. The convenience store, the mistaken identity, the unlikely partnership that had formed in the heat of crisis. Those details would be confined to official reports and the memories of those involved. As Thomas climbed into the waiting SUV, his phone buzzed with yet another message. This one was from Clark. Hoffman talking. "Says there are more cells. This isn't over." Thomas stared at the screen for a long moment before replying, "It never is."